The Mediterranean sun, unrelenting and merciless, blazed down upon the anchored French fleet at Mers el Kebir, casting long, wavering reflections across the still waters of the Algerian harbor. It was July 3rd, 1940, a day already heavy with tension, suspicion, and the bitter taste of defeat. Only 13 days had passed since France, after weeks of valiant but hopeless resistance, had capitulated to the German onslaught. Now, the once proud vessels of the French Navy, a force still powerful, still dangerous, rode at anchor under the burden of uncertainty and shame. Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul, commander of the French squadron, surveyed his assembled ships with a mixture of pride and dread. Before him loomed the sleek, modern battlecruiser Strasbourg, the newest jewel in the French naval crown, its gray hull gleaming in the merciless light. Beside it floated two grand but aging sisters, the battleships Provence and Bretagne, proud veterans of an earlier era, their heavy guns at rest but ready if need be. 6 agile destroyers clustered nearby, their smaller profiles seeming almost fragile compared to the looming capital ships. Moored at a distance, the seaplane tender Commandant Teste completed the group. A curious vessel, both ship and airfield, designed to project French naval power beyond the horizon. At 5:54 in the morning, as the red orb of the sun lifted higher into the sky, a cry echoed from one of the lookouts perched high in the rigging. Dark shapes were spotted, just emerging over the distant shimmer of the horizon. The fleet came to life with sudden tension. Officers grabbed binoculars, signalmen readied their lamps, and gun crews instinctively checked their stations, though no hostile act had yet been committed. Soon the forms solidified into recognizable silhouettes. The towering mast and broad decks of HMS Hood, the mighty battlecruiser of the Royal Navy and pride of Britain's fleet, led a formidable procession. Hood was not alone. Following in her wake were 2 battleships, the aged yet potent HMS Resolution and HMS Valiant, their heavy guns ready for action. Behind them loomed the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, bristling with aircraft that could rain death from the skies, supported by no fewer than 11 destroyers, fanning out like a pack of wolves. It was an awesome, terrifying sight, one that even the most hardened French sailors could not easily dismiss. A sharp flash from the Hood's signal lamps broke the silence, Morse code flickering urgently across the gap between the 2 fleets. The message, when translated, stunned the French officers into silence. "The British Admiralty has sent me to demand you join us or face destruction." It was a message so stark, so brutal in its directness, that it seemed almost beyond belief. Allies, brothers in arms just weeks ago at Dunkirk, fighting side by side against Hitler's armies, now stood poised to turn their guns upon each other. The Royal Navy, once the staunch protector of France, now threatened to annihilate its former comrade. In that blinding moment, it was clear that no amount of shared history, no treaties, no past sacrifices would shield them from the cruel necessities of wartime strategy. Britain, isolated and desperate to prevent the powerful French fleet from falling into German hands, had decided it must act, no matter the cost to honor, friendship, or conscience. Admiral Gensoul, shocked but still composed, knew that whatever happened next would reverberate through history as a tragic chapter of fratricide, the day when old allies, under the crushing weight of war, turned their guns upon one another. In London, under the low gray skies of a city bracing for the storms of war, Prime Minister Winston Churchill grappled with one of the most agonizing decisions of his life. Intelligence reports piled up on his desk, each more alarming than the last, whispering a grim possibility. Despite the formal terms of France's armistice with Germany, Adolf Hitler might seize control of the French fleet at any moment. If those ships, mighty vessels of modern war, fell into Axis hands, the balance of naval power in Europe could tip catastrophically against Britain. The cold arithmetic of survival was brutal, merciless in its clarity. The French Navy boasted 4 powerful battleships, among other vessels, and if even a fraction of that force were commandeered by the Nazis, the Royal Navy could find itself outgunned in its own home waters. Axis naval supremacy would no longer be a distant nightmare, but a very real, immediate threat. Across the Channel, Britain stood alone. The miracle of Dunkirk had saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but it had not changed the strategic reality. France had fallen. Europe had crumbled into Hitler's grasp. The United States watched from afar, reluctant to intervene. The British Empire, spread thin, burdened by far-flung commitments, was the last bastion of organized resistance against fascist tyranny. Every ship mattered. Every strategic decision could determine survival or annihilation. French Admiral Jean-François Darlan, nominally in charge of the French fleet, had offered repeated assurances that the ships would never be surrendered to Germany. He promised they would either sail to safe ports, be demilitarized, or scuttled if necessary. But Churchill, hardened by years of political betrayal and battlefield miscalculations, saw little comfort in promises made under the shadow of defeat. Trust, once squandered, could not easily be regained, and in the pitiless calculus of 1940, hope was not a strategy. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Churchill's mind and soul. He was not merely a wartime leader, he was a man deeply conscious of history's gaze, of the price future generations would pay for errors made in these desperate hours. First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound, a man intimately familiar with the burdens Churchill bore, later recorded the Prime Minister's agonized words as he paced the war cabinet room. "I would rather half of France curse us in defeat than all of Europe fall enslaved." It was not said lightly. It was a grim, sorrowful acknowledgement that sometimes the only choices available to a leader are between different kinds of tragedy. To risk alienating a proud, battered ally was an unspeakably bitter course, but to allow Hitler to seize a battle fleet that could help him dominate the seas, invade Britain, and plunge the world into darkness, that was unthinkable. In that stark moment, Churchill made his choice, a decision forged not out of malice, but from the brutal necessities of survival. He knew the consequences would be terrible. He knew history might judge him harshly, but Churchill also understood something deeper. History would judge even more savagely the leader who had the power to act and chose instead to hope. The ultimatum had been delivered, but the path to resolution was anything but swift. For 9 agonizing hours, the fate of fleets, nations, and perhaps even the future of the war itself hung suspended over the waters of Mers el Kebir. British Vice Admiral James Somerville, commanding Force H, found himself burdened with a task he neither relished nor truly believed in. A lover of French culture and a fluent French speaker, Somerville felt a deep personal sorrow at the prospect of turning guns against former allies. Understanding the gravity of what was being asked, he sought to handle the situation with as much delicacy as duty would allow. To that end, he sent Captain Cedric Holland ashore to negotiate, hoping that a fellow naval officer, speaking directly and respectfully, might convince the French commanders to choose peace over destruction. Holland presented Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul with 4 stark options, none of them easy, all of them heavily laden with implications. Join British forces and continue the fight against Germany as allies once more. Sail to British ports with reduced crews, ensuring the ships could not be used against Britain. Sail to neutral ports, Martinique or the United States, where the ships could be interned and safely disarmed. Scuttle their ships, denying their use to any power. But from the first moments of contact, negotiations were fraught with misunderstanding and wounded pride. Admiral Gensoul, already resentful at Britain's demands, bristled at the perceived insult of having to parley not with Somerville himself, but with a subordinate. a mere captain. In naval tradition, especially among officers of the old European powers, rank was not just a technicality, it was a vital symbol of respect. Jen Sol's sense of honor, already battered by France's defeat, would not allow him to yield easily under such perceived humiliation. As hours dragged on without agreement, both sides edged closer to an irreversible disaster. French crews, sensing the danger, began preparing their ships for battle. Men drilled at their stations, loading and readying guns that had not been intended for British targets. Along the rocky shoreline, coastal artillery crews rammed shells into the breeches of heavy guns that could pound Force H at close range. The French submarine Morse, moored quietly at the start of the standoff, slipped its cables and disappeared beneath the surface, its silent menace adding a new, unseen threat to the tense standoff. Aboard the HMS Hood, the atmosphere was no less tense, but shaded with disbelief. To many British sailors, the idea of actually opening fire on the French, their comrades in so many past battles, still seemed unimaginable. Lieutenant Leonard Reynolds, serving as Hood signals officer, later recalled the strange, almost surreal scene unfolding before them. "We watched French sailors sunbathing on decks. They couldn't believe we'd really fire on Allies." The sun beat down as French sailors lounged casually on the decks of their great ships, stripped to the waist, indifferent to the D. Gun turrets that slowly, inexorably swung to bear upon them. It was a scene out of a nightmare, the moments before a fratricidal storm, where neither side fully believed that blood would soon be spilled between friends. Yet with every passing hour, hope dwindled, and the chance of a peaceful solution ebbed away like the tide. Time and the rising sun made the inevitable seem ever more certain. At 2:55 p.m., after 9 fruitless hours of strained diplomacy and mounting tension, the order every sailor dreads, the order that seems to rend apart the very fabric of comradeship, was given. Vice Admiral James Somerville, his voice heavy with sorrow and grim resolve, uttered the words that would echo across history: "Open fire on the French." The stillness over Mers el Kebir shattered in an instant as the British guns unleashed their fury. From HMS Hood, the massive battlecruiser whose very presence inspired awe, 15-inch guns roared to life, spitting death across the glittering sea. Great geysers of water erupted as the first salvo thundered in, massive shells straddling the French battleship Bretagne. The tremendous force of the barrage sent walls of seawater cascading over decks and superstructures, shrouding the anchorage in mist and spray. Then came catastrophe. A direct hit smashed into Bretagne's magazines, the heart of the ship where tons of explosives were stored. In a blinding flash, the battleship's soul was torn apart. A tremendous explosion ripped through her hull, so violent that witnesses described it as if the very sea had been torn asunder. Metal twisted and screamed. Fire and smoke belched skyward in a pillar of blackness. Bretagne, a proud veteran of the French Navy, heaved up from the water as though some ancient leviathan had stirred in the depths and struck her down. In the blink of an eye, more than 1,000 French sailors, 1,012 souls, were lost, many vaporized where they stood. Nearby, Dunkirk, one of France's newest and most powerful ships, took 3 devastating shell hits. Flames blossomed along her decks and through her superstructure as the battleship struggled desperately to survive. Listing and burning, she was finally run aground by her crew to prevent her sinking outright. The battleship Provence, too, came under savage attack. Her captain, recognizing that resistance was futile and destruction imminent, ordered her to beach herself rather than be sent to the bottom. As she lurched toward the shallows, fires spread uncontrollably across her decks, black smoke pouring into the bright afternoon sky. Amid the chaos, French gunnery officer Lieutenant de Vaisseau Pierre Lavier struggled to put the horror into words. Years later, his haunting description would capture the terrible majesty of that moment. The sea boiled with shell splashes. Then Bretagne lifted from the water like a leviathan breathing its last. It was as if the harbor itself had turned into a battlefield from myth, where monstrous creatures fought and died under a blood-red sun. The roar of guns, the screams of wounded men, the thunderous detonations, all combined into a symphony of destruction, a grim requiem for a brotherhood of sailors torn apart by the cruel imperatives of war. On that day, at that hour, the guns of Mers el Kebir spoke not just of strategy or survival, but of the terrible price demanded when trust is broken, and when desperate nations are forced to betray their oldest friends. In the chaos that followed the devastating opening barrage, amid smoke, fire, and the splintered hulks of proud warships, not all was lost for the French. Seizing a fleeting opportunity, the battle cruiser Strasbourg, the most modern and fastest ship in the French fleet, along with 5 agile destroyers, made a desperate dash for the open sea. Engines straining to their limits, the French ships maneuvered through the narrow exits of Mers el Kebir harbor, threading a gauntlet of danger under the shadow of British guns. The British forces scrambled to respond. Swordfish bombers, launched from the decks of the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, droned into the evening sky, their canvas wings and slow speeds belying the deadly payloads they carried. Dodging anti-aircraft fire, the biplanes swooped low over the escaping French ships. One torpedo struck home, hitting Strasbourg and causing damage, but the great battlecruiser, battered but unbroken, pressed onward. Against all odds, Strasbourg and her escorts slipped into the vastness of the Mediterranean, fleeing toward Toulon and the uncertain future that awaited them. The human cost of the day's tragedy was staggering. A total of 1,297 French sailors lay dead, their lives snuffed out in a battle few had truly believed would come to pass. For Britain, the losses were smaller but no less bitter. 2 brave airmen of the Fleet Air Arm perished in the attack, mourned as deeply by their comrades as any lost on the decks of the French ships. That night, aboard his flagship, Vice Admiral James Somerville sat alone with his thoughts, his heart heavy with regret and sorrow. In his private reflections, he poured out his anguish over the day's events, writing words that would be kept hidden from the public for many years. This is the foulest political decision of modern times. We've betrayed our friends. He had carried out his orders, but at a cost to his soul that no naval victory could erase. Back in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill prepared to face the House of Commons. With characteristic bluntness tempered by grim necessity, he addressed Parliament on the melancholy events at Mers el Kebir. His words, spoken with the weight of a nation's survival upon them, rang through the halls. This melancholy action was indispensable for the safety of Britain. Churchill understood the magnitude of what had been done, the damage to Britain's honor, the seeds of resentment sown among the French people. Yet he also knew that survival sometimes demanded choices so cruel that no rhetoric could soften them. Without decisive action, the French fleet might have been turned against Britain, aiding the very regime that sought to enslave Europe. It was a day of sorrow, a day of shame, but in Churchill's view, a necessary day if Britain was to endure the storm that lay ahead. The echoes of gunfire at Mers el Kebir would not easily fade. They would haunt alliances, poison old friendships, and remind all who fought in the Second World War that even among allies, trust was a fragile, mortal thing. The echoes of Mers el Kebir still reverberate through history, and perhaps nowhere do they resonate more deeply than with older generations who understand, through memory or inheritance, the true cost of war. Not just in lives lost, but in friendships betrayed, and in the long shadows cast across decades. The human cost for the French sailors who survived the onslaught, silence became a second punishment. Under the Vichy regime, the collaborationist government that ruled unoccupied France, Survivors were forbidden to speak openly about Mers el Kebir. The pain of the attack and the deaths of comrades and brothers had to be borne in secret, turned inward into private grief and quiet anger. Mourning became an act of defiance. Memories, an invisible burden. On the British side, too, there was little triumph. Many Royal Navy sailors, horrified by the necessity of what they had done, found themselves unable to reconcile their actions with their consciences. Records reveal a surge in requests for transfers out of Force H in the weeks following the battle, a silent protest, a way for men to remove themselves from the unbearable weight of fratricide. Duty had demanded they fire upon friends. Their hearts struggled to live with it. The strategic reality. Yet stripped of sentiment, the strategic consequences were undeniable, and in the cold calculus of survival, vital. The destruction and neutralization of the French fleet sent a powerful, unmistakable message to Adolf Hitler. Britain would stop at nothing to defend itself. It would not flinch from the harshest measures, even against former allies, if the survival of the nation required it. This ruthless demonstration of will helped dissuade the Führer from launching Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Britain. Furthermore, securing naval dominance in the Mediterranean was crucial. It kept vital supply lines open to North Africa and the Middle East, laid the groundwork for future campaigns like the liberation of North Africa, Sicily, and ultimately Italy. In strategic terms, Mers el Kebir was a tragic victory, bought dearly but indispensable. Lasting wounds. Yet the human heart does not forget so easily. Even decades later, the scars remained raw. In 1956, 16 years after the guns fell silent, French naval officers pointedly refused to attend a memorial ceremony aboard HMS Hood's successor, demonstrating that bitterness still ran deep. Only in 2012, more than 70 years after the battle, was a joint UK-French memorial finally erected at Mers el Kebir itself. Veterans from both sides gathered to honor the dead together at last, acknowledging the complexity of their shared history. Comrades once, enemies for a day, bound forever by a terrible necessity. One such veteran was Jean Lemaire, who had served aboard the doomed Bretagne and lost his brother in the Inferno. When asked to speak at the memorial's dedication, he summed up the tragedy with the simple, aching wisdom only those who have truly endured can offer. War makes monsters of us all, but I understand why they did it. It is this complex, painful, deeply human truth that continues to resonate so profoundly with older audiences. Mers el Kebir is not just a tale of ships and shells, but a testament to the agonizing choices forced upon good men in terrible times. A reminder that in war, there are often no victories without sorrow, and no survival. A moral calculus for the ages. As the story of Mers el Kebir draws to its close, the weight of its legacy becomes impossible to ignore. Suggested closing sequence. The camera glides across the rusting, wave-washed remains of the sunken Bretagne, her shattered form still visible beneath the Mediterranean sun. It lingers briefly on the Franco-British memorial plaque, its simple words heavy with meaning. Then, with a subtle dissolve, the scene shifts. Black and white newsreel footage flickers to life, showing Winston Churchill rising solemnly before the House of Commons in 1940. His voice carrying the burden of a nation's survival. This is not just history preserved in books or memorials. It is living memory, especially for your 60-plus audience. Personal connection. Many of them, or their parents, vividly recall Churchill's somber radio address announcing the attack. The crackle of his voice on wartime radios still echoes in their ears, a chilling reminder of the terrible sacrifices demanded by a war for survival. Moral complexity. Mers el Kebir offers far more than dates and battles. It opens the door to real, thoughtful conversation. It forces us to ask timeless questions. When is betrayal necessary? Can loyalty survive when nations collide? What price should be paid for the future? Untold stories. For decades, the full French perspective remained hidden. Survivors were silenced under Vichy rule, and it was not until much later, often in whispered memoirs or long-suppressed interviews, that the human anguish from the other side truly came to light. These late-emerging testimonies give new depth to a story many thought they already knew. As you craft this episode or article, consider if you would like to include additional powerful materials to deepen the impact. Full translated French naval logs. Offer your audience a rare glimpse into what French officers recorded at the moment disaster struck. Letters from British sailors to French pen pals. Humanize the event even further, showing the personal friendships shattered by the guns of Mers el Kebir. Declassified intelligence about German intentions. Reveal the real fears driving Churchill's terrible choice, and whether they were justified. Comparison to the scuttling at Toulon in 1942. Show how the French Navy later chose destruction over surrender, echoing and answering the trauma of 1940. This is not just a story about ships and strategy. It is about loyalty and survival, duty and betrayal, and how, in war, even the best of choices can carry unbearable costs. Mers el Kebir remains a mirror we hold up to ourselves, asking hard questions that, perhaps, have no simple answers, precisely the kind of rich layered storytelling that your thoughtful audience cherishes.